The U.S. Coast Guard has been a leader in performance improvement and electronic performance support systems, or EPSS, for a long time. I first started following the Coast Guard's work in EPSS with the first ISPI conference I attended in 1989. Both the Coast Guard and DLS group where I worked were early adopters of EPSS, and we'd sit in on each other's sessions to share what we'd been working on. Fast forward years later, and I had the pleasure of sitting on Dan's comprehensive oral exam for what was then the IPT degree. He talked about building an EPSS for the Coast Guard and how that work won an award from ISPI. Dan is here again to share his latest award-winning EPSS with us, the checklist generator. During his time with us, Dan will discuss the HPT process for creating this EPSS. He'll talk about performance analysis, EPSS creation and implementation, evaluation, and organizational impact. Dan will also answer your questions about EPSS and HPT. As with all of the Talking Shop webinars, we envision more of a dialogue than a one-way presentation. Dan, we're delighted to have you here with us today.
All right, great. Well, thanks for showing up, everybody. So, as Steve said, my name's Dan Hardin. I work for the United States Coast Guard. I work here in Seattle in what we call our 13th Coast Guard District, and I am the program manager for the Commercial Fishing Vessel Safety Program. And so that's how I got involved with this particular problem that we had to solve Coast Guard-wide. And so I wound up developing this EPSS. So I'd first like to let you know that I have a website. It's called fishsafewest.info. It's right there on the screen. And the EPSS notes that that you can download if you want to is right there on the link there. And in fact, everything that I show you today will be available, and you can download it if you want to. For future projects and whatever. So welcome, and let's get started. We've got a long way to go. So first I'd like to tell you that I am doing a similar presentation to this one at the 2018 ISPI conference on Monday, April 9th. You'll need to check the schedule for that. So if you're going to attend the ISPI conference, I would welcome you to attend the presentation that I'll be doing on that Monday, where we'll actually take a lot deeper look into developing the EPSS and how you do that. So we'll be able to touch on that topic today, but we won't have time to really get into it. But during the presentation at the ISPI conference here in Seattle, we'll be getting really deep into it and how you develop an EPSS. I don't expect that a performance technologist would necessarily have the skills to develop an EPSS, but everything else that you do up to the development of that, and we'll talk about that specifically, you can hand off to a web developer that could develop the tool for you, but everything that you would do up to that, including the analysis, will all apply to making the development of that EPSS relatively. So let's get started. So first I'd like to say that this is a case study that you can use. This is not proprietary information like other presentations you might go to, because as a taxpayer, you've all paid for this because you all pay your taxes, and the Coast Guard developed this, or I developed this for the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard paid me during that time. So everything that I share with you, you can share with others. So for example, if you come up to a particular case where you're going to develop an electronic performance support tool for a client of yours, and they want to know, well, you know, what value would this have, or, you know, how do I know how successful this will be? You can provide them an example of an EPSS that saved the federal government at least $3 million. That more than that now, but we'll go through that specifically. But it's a good case study that you could present. So first, let me talk a little bit about the Coast Guard and human performance technology. The U.S. Coast Guard, here, this link, and again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint also. U.S. Coast Guard has the Coast Guard training manual that tells the Coast Guard how to do what it does, and so we're going to take a look at that. So here's the Coast Guard's training manual. So it's the Performance Training and Education Manual, and if we go down, I want to share something with you. So on the very first page of our training manual, it talks about human performance systems. And I'm going to go ahead and read this for everybody. It says, the human performance system enables mission execution through the integration and accession, training, education, and professional development. This system drives the integration of skills and knowledge, tools and resources, consequences and incentives, selection and assignment, and motives and preferences across the organization. So I'm say within the human performance system is the training system. So if anybody here is familiar with Gilbert's behavior engineering model and the actual heart of the HPT model, that is it right there. It explains all the parts of Gilbert's. Down at the bottom, it specifically orders the Coast Guard. ForceCom here is the section at headquarters that tells us how to organize and handle performance related to our people. Paragraph C, I've highlighted, it says that we're required to implement human performance technology as it applies to organization performance problems, identify root causes of job performance problems, and develop appropriate solutions. And it reminds us that training and education are only a subset of that solution. So the Coast Guard's actually adopted HPT as the way of doing business. So, the human performance technology model that ISPI prescribes to is the model that we use, and we're going to use that today. I used it for the development of my performance support solution based on the problem that we had identified. So let me tell you a little bit about the commercial fishing industry. The Coast Guard has responsibilities to ensure or to try to make sure that that particular industry is safe. We respond to search and rescue of commercial fishing vessels in trouble. And I work for the prevention department, so what we try to do is prevent accidents in this particular field, and so that's really my job here in Seattle. So if you can see right here, this is from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, and I'm using the 2009 version because that's when the project first started. So we'll talk about 2009. If we have time later, we can talk about how things are going now. But let's go back to 2009, and if you look at these statistics, you'll see that the most hazardous occupation in the country is or was commercial fishing, so fishers and related fishing workers. And so 56 people died in the industry in 2009 as a result of some casualty or fatality at sea. And you'll notice that although it's only 56 people, it's 56 people out of the total number of people that are in the workforce. So it was 200 times the national average. So the national average of all workers is 3.3. You'll see that for fishing vessel or fishing operators and people, that was 200. So it's an extremely high rate, and that draws a lot of political attention. So Congress passed in 2010 what they called the Coast Guard Authorization Act, and it was modified by the Authorization Act in 2012. But as a result of these casualties in this industry, one of the things that they did is they required that these fishing vessels get mandatory dockside exams, and they had originally, in the 2010 Auth Act, they had sent that, or told us that that would be required by the 15th of October 2012. In 2012, they changed that date to October 15, 2015. And these for every vessel that operates beyond 3 nautical miles from shore. So anybody out in the ocean beyond 3 miles is required to comply by getting a mandatory exam. And so in that bill, they also provided the Coast Guard with 67 proposed new billets of people around the country to help take on this extra burden where the Coast Guard would have to visit all these vessels and do these dockside exams. But if you remember back in that time frame, that's the year that sequestration hit, and we were not able to fill those billets. So we had all this work to do, no change in its applicability or when it had to be accomplished. And so we had a performance gap that I was really concerned about, and the entire Coast Guard was concerned about. And so being a performance technologist myself, I figured that I would try to take this on and see if I could come up with a solution. So let's talk about the performance gap then. How many vessels are affected and how many man hours will all this cost us? So, according to our headquarters program manager in an article they wrote in the Proceedings magazine to the fishing industry, they calculated there were about 35,000 commercial fishing vessels that would be impacted by this regulation. They also said that they knew that we had a bunch of vessels with our existing program where we provided courtesy docs at exams. This was a voluntary exam, but it would teach them or tell them everything they would need so they could be in compliance. And so they estimated that approximately 10% of the fleet, or 3,500 vessels, were actually already in our program, and we had people out in the field that were doing these courtesy docs at exams. So now that these exams were mandatory for another 31,500 vessels, and we had to get them in compliance by the 15th October of 2015, that we had a gap that we had to close, and we didn't have any extra people to do it, and a lot of man hours are going to be taken up by doing this. So ultimately, then, vessels that failed to come into compliance by that date would be in violation, and they couldn't operate out and go fishing anymore. So that was a big deal for the commercial fishermen. The problem with our regulations is the fishing vessel safety regulations are really complex to understand what equipment applies to your particular vessel. You're going to learn that as we go through this example, this case study, as to how complex the regulations kind of get. So the opportunity to improve performance, each visit to a vessel I calculated was about 3.5 hours. That's about 2 hours travel time and about 1.5 hours at the vessel. And we knew that each vessel that's new to the program and has never been examined before is going to need 2 visits. The first visit, one of our examiners would go out, meet the vessel at the dock, examine the vessel, see what the vessel already had on board, and then write them a work list of the stuff that they needed for their vessel based on a bunch of operating parameters. For example, how many people on board the vessel, how far offshore do they operate, a bunch of different parameters that make regs apply or not apply. And then we'd leave the vessel, the person would get all that stuff, get it back on their boat, and then we'd go back out, examine all that equipment, make sure it's all there, and make sure that it's in serviceable condition. So that's 2 visits for each vessel. So to me, that's a performance improvement opportunity. If I could reduce that to just 1 visit rather than 2 visits, with the first visit being like a training visit, telling them what they need, and then another visit to examine the vessel, if I could develop a way to make it just 1 visit, I could at least cut our man hours in half, which ultimately is about 67 additional people over several years' time. So, for example, I've got calculations here. It's 3.5 hours to do an exam, make 2 visits on 31,500 vessels. That's 220,000 some man hours. If I could reduce that just to 1 visit, then that cuts that in half. I could save 110,000, 250 man hours. So let's go back to, or let's do cause analysis, and this is the heart of the behavior engineering. This is the behavior engineering model, or the heart of the EPSS model. And our problem was that the regulations are really numerous and they're complex to apply, depending on a lot of different operating parameters. And again, I'll show you that in a little bit. And the problem with the regulations, too, is they're written by lawyers, and we're talking about a bunch of folks that are just trying to get their job done out in the real world and really aren't lawyers. So the problem was information. And so if we look at the behavior engineering model, see that under information, we can either provide information in the environment, or we can put information in the person by doing training. So what I normally like to use is Harlitz's job aid versus memory analysis. Job aid, and although there's a flow chart to it, here's the basics of it. He says that a job aid is recommended if the frequency of performance is relatively infrequent. For example, if you only do this once a year or every 2 years, even if I teach you how to do that, you're not going to remember it in a couple of years. He also recommends if the complexity of the task is high, that a job aid is indicated, and if consequences for failure is extremely high, that also indicates that a job aid should be used, not necessarily training. The third thing he recommends is develop a job aid in circumstances where the regulations change pretty often. And that doesn't happen very often for us, but the other 3 did definitely apply. So provided data in the environment was indicated, and so the potential to improve performance here then if I could just provide some kind of a job aid that they could use that would get them into compliance before we got there for the first visit, we could save a lot of time and a lot of money. So then I want to just talk about job aids. I kind of divide job aids up into two areas. One is a job aid, and I think we've all seen those, where it's maybe a paper flow chart, or even if it's presented electronically, it's pretty static. It's not really dynamic. And in my opinion, electronic performance support tool, or a thing that we now all call apps, are more dynamic. They're smarter, they're flexible, they can think, they can do stuff for us, and change the output based on input from the user. So here we are at the heart of the HPT model. So again, I'm trying to use the HPT model to validate what's happening. So at this point, I just ask, are there any questions as to where we are so far?
I don't see anybody typing, but I do have one that I'd like to ask in terms of how you first found out about job aids and EPSS.
So when I was
where did you learn about this?
Okay, so I was active duty in the Coast Guard, and I was actually in the training. I was at a school as a trainer at what we call our A school for aviation survivalmen, which was my rate at the time. And then eventually I also went to our Coast Guard instructor training school as an instructor there. And so I attended Joe Harless's job aids workshop, and it was there that I actually met Dr. Joe Harless and learned about job aids. Actually, I was developing job aids before I even knew what they were, but when I was in the field, I would design different flow charts or whatever so that people wouldn't forget certain things that I was finding that they were forgetting. So I would make checklists and flow charts to make people's lives easier. So I think we all know what job aids are, but we just, I want to tell your performance technologists to know there's actually a name for it and how I learned about it. So when I talked to Dr. Joe Harless, that was quite an epiphany. All right, if there's no other questions, I'll just go in and show you what the checklist generator looks like, and then we can talk more about whether or not we close the performance gap at the end. So let me light it up here. I want to remind you that there's two things that a commercial fisherman needs to be able to do. One, the commercial fisherman, in order to prepare his vessel for examination, needs to be aware of what it is the vessel is required to have on board their vessel. And then two, they need to be able to examine that piece of equipment and make sure it's in acceptable or serviceable condition, so that we come out and look at it and examine the item. They pass, they get their decal so they can get underway and go fishing, which is really what they want to do. So let's open up. So I'm going to go to my website, fishsafewest.info. Right here on the first page, you'll see that there's a checklist generator to prepare your vessel. So let's take them there. So this is the checklist generator. One thing I'd like to show you about the checklist generator is that it was developed using responsive web design strategy. Talk about that more later. So this will work on a phone, it'll work on a laptop, a tablet, or whatever. So let's get started. All right, so what we have to do is we have to collect information from the user, and then based on this information, checklist generator will generate them a custom checklist for their particular vessel. So we'll just go through this really quick. So let's say, for example, my vessel is 54.5 foot long. So it's important to know what the vessel's length is, because regulations are applicable based on the vessel's length. I need to know how many people on board the vessel. That's something I need to know. Let's say I'm 3 people on board. I want you to watch. I hide stuff from the user unless they have to answer the question. Then I make it visible. So, for example, if I do a drop down here, I'm on out to 50 miles from shore. You'll notice that something else showed up here. So I don't ask a question unless I absolutely positively have to ask a question. So I've developed it so that questions are hidden. If they don't need to be asked, then they don't get asked. Select the vessel type. Select where in the world that you're going to be operating. For example, Alaska, you can imagine, is cold water, so that affects what regulations you have to comply with. If you're on the East Coast, or if you're in the Gulf Coast, or if you're in Hawaii, all these different things make it different as to different requirements. So we'll say the West Coast of the United States. Now you notice here that there's a bunch of yes/no questions. Again, I either use drop-downs, yes or no questions, and if I have to, then I'll provide a field for them to enter information, specifically, for example, vessel length or whatever. So here it's asking some questions like, is the vessel documented as opposed to state registered? That makes a difference in the regulations. So we'll say yes. You notice that when I selected yes, another item down at the bottom showed up. So if it's yes, then a vessel that's documented has gross tonnage, which is a calculation of its volumetric measurement. And I need to know that for the regulations, so I make that visible to them. If you're state registered, then you won't have that information on your document. Does the vessel have an installed toilet? Yes or no? There are regulations related to toilets, so if you don't have one, you don't need to see the regulations for that. If the vessel is constructed of metal, then I can see you on radar. If not, if you're wood, then you need a radar reflector, and so that's what that's there for. So each one of these questions, make regulations apply or not apply. So I'll just go through, and there'll be more stuff showing up. I'm going to fill in this number. You'll notice I left one thing blank right here. I'll hit the next button. Watch for that. Yeah, I stop it because if something's missing, it's going to totally destroy the checklist generator that gets generated. So we've got to make sure that they've answered all the questions. All right, so that's all the questions. There are a bunch of other questions that the user could have seen, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But here's the vessel that I entered, and they've seen all the screens that they need to see for this particular vessel. Now I have enough information for that particular vessel to create a checklist, so I'll just push checklist. Now here's the checklist that the fishermen would use to prepare their vessel. This vessel is for this checklist is specific for the vessel that I entered there. Here at the bottom again is that criteria that was entered for my particular vessel. And so, then I've divided it up into different areas. So first, I grouped a bunch of them together under documents, placards, and plans, all things that are kind of alike. Anything that's required up on the bridge or the navigation equipment for the vessel. Here's the life-saving equipment for the vessel. Again, this is particular for this particular vessel. For example, they need an immersion suit or exposure suit for everybody on board. Another vessel might just need what we call a PFD or a life jacket. Here's an inflatable life raft and a soulless BPAC. Some will need an APAC. Some might need just a floating buoyant apparatus. There's all kinds of different inflatable devices that you need. Your ring buoy, emergency position indicating radio beacon. Go down here to firefighting equipment. This is what they need. So this particular vessel needs 2 B1 fire extinguishers. And then there's the last catch-all area is the engine room and any vessel area. And so what the fisherman does is he or she goes through and says, okay, I need the vessel documentation paperwork on board. That would not say documented if it was a state-registered boat, so that would have been a different answer for a different vessel with a different answer up in the front. And then there's just a little check button here so they can keep track of what they've done and what they've checked to make sure they have it on board. Go down here. And so you can just keep on checking off stuff and keep on working at it until you're finally done. And again, that's what I want the commercial fishermen to do. Know exactly what they need and know when they got a good one or a bad one and they need to fix it or whatever. Okay, so let's look at, for example, here's 3 parachute flares. And over to the right of every one of these list items on the checklist, a little info button that will tell them what to look for a particular item. So, for example, at my 3 parachute flares, you have to have these Coast Guard approval numbers on them. And I push this button, and I get a drop-down list that says, check the condition of the outer case, no major dents, corrosion, or leaking. Make sure they're not expired. Make sure you have enough on board. Make sure you have the correct approval number. And expired flares may be carried for drills. Up here, we provide them the actual reg site for this particular item. So if I touch on that link there, I get the reg site for distress signals. So we have a lot of sea lawyers, what I call sea lawyers out there, that like to say, well, wait a minute, where'd that regulation come from? Well, here's the regulation. Also, we have a little video that we can play. I'm not going to play it, but we have a little YouTube channel. If I were to touch that link there, then a little YouTube video would come up, and they can actually watch a YouTube of one of my examiners examining a flare to make sure it's in good condition. So what the checklist generator is doing then is providing a list of what the vessel is required to have and how to examine each item on board the vessel to make sure it's in satisfactory condition. Here, let me show you this for your navigation lights. Here are the navigation lights for this size of vessel. This is what the navigation lights should look like. You see they have a red and white, or red and green navigation lights. how their mast headlights should look, and it goes all the way to exactly how they should be worked and how they're spaced and all that kind of stuff. So it shows them everything they need to know about their nav lights. It also has all the regulations related to their nav lights up here that they can look up. So each item has that information that can help them prepare for the examination. So that's just a general basic example of how the device, how the software works or the app works. There's also a link here, so once you're done with your exam, you can contact anybody across the country to come out and do an exam for you. So they're all listed here. So for example, in the 13th district there, Seattle, down in Portland is Mr. Farrell. You can email them or call them on the phone. You can also print this list off and take it to the boat with you if you want. There's also a back button if you want to start over again. That's the checklist. So I would ask, are there any questions?
Yes. You've got both questions and comments. Lisa Hansen commented, nice overview. Kristen commented, love how you put every information in there at the point of need and that you provided an excellent diagram.
Great, thanks. Okay.
Polly asked, how did you test this to know that you had the right questions and who did you test it with?
Okay, there was, that's a good question. There was two different people that I was working with. One were the subject matter experts. So you saw that list there. There are people all over the country that have been trained at our Commercial Fishing Vessel Examiners course in Yorktown, Virginia. It's a one-week course that all our people go to that trains them on the applicability of the regulations and how to do the exam of commercial fishing vessels. So I sent them, each district has a coordinator. I'm a coordinator here in Seattle. And then under the coordinator, they have all these dockside examiners that go out and do these exams. So I sent the checklist generator link out to everybody and asked them to break it. Asked them if it made sense. They were the first people to provide me feedback on zeroing this down to getting it to the level that a commercial fisherman would understand it. Then the next stage was actually to send it out to specific commercial fishermen that we knew in the field, both down, the guys in the Gulf Coast, some of the guys on the East Coast, some guys in the West Coast, some guys in Hawaii. So we sent it all over to try to get people to break it or to give us feedback. And then I got all the email feedback. And I've saved all that email feedback. That's all in one folder on the Outlook file. And that feedback made the recommendations for changes that ultimately affected the app. How are we doing on time, Steve?
We're at 12:35, and I've got two more questions for you.
Okay.
Lori asked, can the checklist generator be used offline, meaning if you don't have internet access, can the checklist program be downloadable for use?
It's not currently right now. I am working on a version of that. The problem is some of the links, if you don't have access to the internet, you'd have to download all those documents with the app, and that would make the app really, really big. So a web-based version, the web-based version is really the way that I can keep it up to date. But I am working on one. For example, some of the Alaska guys want one. I'm developing one that they can take offline and go out and do that.
And Kristen asks, is your job title performance technologist?
It is not. I am the Commercial Fishing Vessel Safety Coordinator for the 13th Coast Guard District. I just happen to be a performance technologist.
And so that's what you bring to your official title?
Yes. Now, the Coast Guard does have performance technologists. In fact, I understand you have several in one of your classes right now from the Coast Guard. So as you can see from the beginning is that the Coast Guard believes in performance technology. The Coast Guard does have performance technologists that are in training positions at the training centers at the headquarters management level. But I just happen to be a performance technologist that's actually in the field. And so I was really the only performance technologist that was also a subject matter expert in the field of the Commercial Fishing Vessel Safety Program. And so this was my opportunity to actually close a huge performance gap, being in the right place at the right time, I guess you could say.
Thank you.
All right, we'll continue on. All right, so if we look back at the HPT model, we've gone all the way to this point, intervention, selection, and design. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the design now. But I've selected to develop performance support. It's a non-instructional intervention. I was looking to develop a performance support tool that didn't need any training whatsoever. It needed to be intuitive, and so those were the targets that I was trying to hit. So let me take you through the design process a little bit now. So the first thing that I did before I even developed the job aid or the app was I led a task analysis, and what we did is we asked the question, what regulations are applicable and under what circumstances? And so what I asked my SMEs or my subject matter experts to do, help me develop a list of every item that might be required aboard a commercial fishing vessel. And then I knew also that what the person had to do is not only determine what was applicable to their vessel or what this job aid needed to do, also needed to assist them to examine the item to ensure it's in service and condition. So let's look at a task analysis then. Again, you'll have access to all these documents if you want to view them later. And so here is, under the Documents, Placards, and Plans section, you might need a vessel document. You would need your state registration. The master or some of the people on board the vessel, depending on how large the vessel is in tonnage, would need a license, like a driver's license. Some vessels don't need them. In some situations, you are required to be a U.S. citizen to operate a vessel in the United States. You have to have an FCC ship station license, a waste management plan. These are all pollution requirements that you have to have aboard your vessel, and that's dependent on operating parameters. Here's first aid training, CPR training. These are the number of people that might need that training. So you have to post emergency instructions, and it depends on what vessel as to what you have to have on board. So these are all the potential documents or placards or plans you might need to have on board your vessel. Here's the navigation equipment. Here's the flares, emergency flares here. Excuse me, your navigation lights, a day shape, a bell for signaling, a horn, whistles, first aid equipment, all the stuff that would be on the bridge. Here, this one really got complex. These are everything to do with survival equipment. So here you have your emergency suits, personal flotation devices. Some vessels don't need a survival craft at all. Some need a buoyant apparatus. There's another device called a life float. There's an inflatable buoyant apparatus. There's an inflatable life raft. There's an inflatable life raft with sold as VPAC. There's an inflatable life raft with sold as APAC, and so on and so forth. And for example, then what we did is we said, okay, well, when is the SOLAS B life raft required? You look over here, then it says, if the vessel's documented and operating beyond the boundary line, or if it's in location 6 here, 20 to 50 miles from shore, and if you're in cold water, then you would need to have one of these things. So again, a performance technologist would be good at doing this task analysis and getting their subject matter experts to list everything that is possibly applicable to the vessel, that any vessel anywhere, and then identify the applicability parameters under which situation that item would be required. And that is really the brains, ultimately becomes the brains of the app itself. And so we did that for every item aboard the vessel, and there they all are right there. And so now that I'm armed with that information, let's go back. Now what are the circumstances that make the items applicable? I call these the applicability parameters. So you saw that we generated those in the task analysis. And so I just then went and captured that stuff. Let me show that. And so what this does, the applicability parameters, are all the questions I need to ask the user. So I need to ask the question, what is your vessel's length? I need to know that so I was able to go to here and pull off all of the questions I needed to ask. And so these are the questions. And so here's my applicability parameters again. Vessel length, I need to know its gross tonnage in some situations. Sometimes I don't. If you're a state registered boat, then I don't want to get that from you because you don't have it. So I won't ask you that question unless you're documented vessel. So you can see how sometimes I want to ask a question, sometimes I don't. And so we'll talk about that. I I need to know the number of people on board the vessel based on this information that I had. That stuff. I need to know what kind of vessel are you, a fishing vessel, a fish processing vessel, or a fish tender vessel. There's different kinds of vessels. The fishermen know what those are. I need to know if the vessel's operating in cold or warm water. Sometimes I'll know that automatically. For example, if they said they were in Alaska, they're in cold water. If they're in Hawaii, they're in warm water. If you're on the west coast of the United States, then if you're south of Point Reyes, California, you might be in warm or cold water. So I have another screen that they didn't see in this particular situation, where I would ask them, do they ever operate in warm water, and I would show them a chart of where the warm water, cold water line is, depending on the time of year. And then so on. There's more questions. All these operating parameters come from that task analysis. And so then it's important for me as the designer or your designer to develop fields to capture this data, so that then I can run a bunch of if-then statements and create my checklist. So these are questions you need to ask the user in order to generate the checklist. So here's the tools that I use to develop the EPSS or the app. So, and a few things as a performance technologist you'll need to kind of understand and talk to your web designer, unless you are one yourself. So there's 4 different things that I had to do. One, I used HTML to develop the actual screens. So that's all HTML does. It's not smart. It identifies links and creates tables and does the code, the font code, and what color the background's going to be and all that stuff. So that's what HTML does. And you'll design your fields. And then JavaScript is the brains of the logic. So that's where I get to I collect all the variables using HTML. I put them in variables in JavaScript, and then I've run a bunch of if-then statements and create tables from that. There's a code called .asp. One of the things I found out is if you have a screen and then you get some information in that screen and then you go to another screen, all that information disappears. So you have to use ASP to save that in the server. Then when the new screen opens up, you pull that back using ASP. So just a little thing there. Then finally, as I showed you before, I used a program called Bootstrap, which is a framework that you can use to develop responsive web design, so that it'll modify itself for a phone size or a full desktop size. So these are the basic tools that a developer would need to develop the database. So let me show you the flow of the screens that we developed. So the checklist generator has a flow. The strategy is to capture all the applicable variables from the user. We talked about that. Avoid asking unnecessary questions. I think that's extremely important. Use data validation, like I showed you, to ensure that they've answered all their questions, and it needs to error out and have them go back and enter that information, because that missing data will generate an inaccurate checklist. So let me show you the screens, the flow chart of the screen. So these are the screens that you saw. Here's the opening screen. Here's the second screen that captures information. Then the third screen you all saw. The screens that you guys didn't see was dependent on what I answered in these screens as to whether or not you would get to see this next screen, which is a question about the boundary line. And so we didn't see that because of this flow chart that tells me if this screen should be presented or not. And then we come out, there's another screen down here. Here's my warm water, cold water screen. So if they answered these particular questions, if these things happen in the flow, then it would send me to the screen. Otherwise, I would bypass this screen, go down here. There's another question I need to ask, but again, they didn't see that, and I hid that from them unless they answered something above that required this to come into play. Again, if you come and see me at ISPI, we'll talk about this in way more in depth. There's some more questions about gas-powered engines. We didn't select a gas-powered engine, so they didn't get to see these screens. Ultimately, this is a screen. You need to present a screen that says, okay, these are all the things that you selected for your particular vessel. And ultimately, once that's done, and I hit that button right there, a bunch of if-then scripting comes up and generates a checklist right here. So that's how I managed whether or not to show them additional information, was through these questions and coding. I do want to show you something else. So that's how I managed presenting only information they need to know. So these are, here's my drop down. So this says these are all the drop downs that I designed. You guys saw these drop downs. You saw this drop down. It says this field's not visible unless distance offshore above is 3 miles or more from shore. So when they selected from here how far offshore they were going, this one only showed up when you're greater than 3 miles from shore. All of these yes, no questions always show up, but these only show up under certain scenarios. And here is the key as to when each one of those items will show up. And if you guys want to, you can look at this later. Again, you have access to this document. But this tells you when each one of these screens would potentially show up. And I'm controlling their navigation. All right, so that was the development of the app. I want to just bring us to the evaluation section. Let's see if we close the performance gap. I know we're getting close on time, but I do want to show you this. So I did a couple of evaluations. So the first question was, how well did the solution close or alleviate the performance gap? So what I did is I sent out a survey monkey to all my dockside examiners across the country, to their district coordinators, and asked them to answer 3 questions. And so the very first report right there on the left-hand side tells me that I got 47 responses from 81 of our dockside examiners in the field. That was a 60% response rate. My first question was in your experience, does the checklist generator provide the user with an accurate equipment list for your area? And so I got 80% said yes. And so that was back when we first put the thing out. The second question, in your experience before the checklist generator, how many visits would a fishing vessel new to the program require in order to pass the exam? And so you can see that a large number said 2. Some people said more than 2. And then the last question was, if the checklist generator is used, how often does this result in the vessel passing the exam on the first visit? So you can see that that majority said 90% of the time, some said 80, then you can see the drop off from there. That's telling me that the checklist generator is making a difference at least 80 to 90% of the time. So we're reducing the number of visits that we need to make to the vessel. So let me show you the last thing that I did is on Google Analytics is code that you can put on a web page to see how many people visit your web page. And so this tells me how many people visited the website. So from August 17th of 2014 to September 14th, 2015, I had 11,699 visitors to the website. So that's average of about 30 users per day. And then from September 14th, 2015 to August 1, 2016, which was the time that everybody needed to be done. Remember, September 15th, 2015 was the drop dead date, and you couldn't be out operating in the water past that date, or you'd be in violation and be sent back to the dock. But a lot of fishing vessels don't go fishing until their fishery opens. So even though the drop dead date was 2015, on September 15th, 2015, for example, the Dungeness crab fishery wouldn't open up until like in July or June, or another fishery, salmon fishery, might not show up until the spring or whatever. So vessels wouldn't be on the water, but they would want to get examined before their fishery opened up, so then they would get their exam. So after that drop dead date, then people were still coming to us. So here you can see the September 15, 2015 to August 1, 2016. We had 8,538 people that used the checklist generator. That's an average of about 27 people a day. So let's look at those numbers then. So if you add those 2 website users, we get 20,237 users access the website as of August 1, 2016. If each used the solution to prepare their vessel, that's 20,237 times 3.5 man-hours saved per vessel, for a potential saving of 70,829 man-hours saved. And then I went to our accounting people to find out how much all of those people would have cost to hire them. They told me that it's $1,008 approximately for each person hired as a full-time dockside examiner. That's $52.90 per hour. If 5290 per hour times that number of vessels, 70,829 man-hours saved. That's a savings of $3,746,854. And then even if 70% of those vessels pass the exam the first time, that's still a saving of $2.5 million in people that we didn't have to hire. So my conclusion then is the checklist generator closed the originally identified performance gap by reducing the number of man-hours necessary to bring all these vessels into compliance with the commercial fishing vessel safety regulations. It saved us from hiring all of those 67 people and saved us that many man-hours and that much money. And then finally, I would just show you that, remember that we were number one, now we're number two. So we're not the most hazardous occupation in the country. We're the second most hazardous occupation in the country. But I think that's also a place that you can look to when you're doing your evaluation as to whether or not it made a difference. And so you can see that we dropped from 56 deaths in 2009 to 24 deaths in 2016. So I think that's another indicator. So I'll open it up to questions.
You already answered Polly's question, wondering about whether the number of deaths decreased since the implementation of the checklist generator. Lisa commented your explanation of the tools that you used was really helpful. Thank you. Kristen commented those savings are incredible from one intervention. I know you've done a number of EPSS over time. Is the savings for this one larger or about the same or less than some of the other EPSS work you've done?
So this is my first EPSS. Okay, so the way I look at it is like this. All the EPSSs that I developed before were for use inside of the Coast Guard. So I was thinking about Coast Guard personnel. For example, I did a similar application for my boarding officers at sea. I found they were making mistakes in writing up regulations that weren't applicable to particular vessels, so I developed them an EPSS tool to keep them from making that mistake. That measurement's different. If you can see that this solution actually didn't reach inside the Coast Guard, it reached to our customers outside the Coast Guard and made them successful, so then they made us more successful. And so I don't think that I've ever saved that much money before, and you know, I was battling as to how to prove whether or not it made a difference or not, and whether or not the performance gap was closed. And so that was my strategy for doing it. So just a couple ideas on how you could make a decision as to whether or not it made a difference.
And we have a few people typing questions. I'm going to slip another question in as they're doing that. I'm curious about the cast of characters who supported this effort. You mentioned yourself, you mentioned subject matter experts. Who was involved and what did on your team and what did they do?
Okay, well, first I had to get the buy-in from my program manager at headquarters. And once I had the buy-in from the, you know, when I did the initial examination of what we could potentially say, potential to improve performance, I won my boss at headquarters over by presenting that to him. He then provided me access to all the district coordinators across the country, like myself, to assist in the work. Then each one of their people in the field, the dockside examiners in the field that work for each one of the district coordinators, were then on board to assist. And so I really used, I tried to keep my SMEs local, the ones that I used consistently. So it was myself, my guys at my station here in Seattle, and my guys down in Portland. And a couple of my guys in Portland were actually kind of programmer, kind of flow charting kind of guys. I used them a lot to do a brain trust as to how we're going to develop this thing and the if-then statements that would create. So I reached out to a lot of those folks. I left the fishermen out until the end because they really don't know the regulations as much as I needed to see whether or not the solution was easy for them or intuitive for them. That's kind of how I kind of worked with everybody. I would like to show you guys something since I've got it here. It'd probably be pretty easy to kind of show you how the scripting works real quick. So remember, I've got all this information that I need to collect from the user. So I need to know the vessel length, the number of people on board, and all that kind of stuff. So in the scripting language, I just set a variable for example, V length was for the vessel's length. V for variable POB is the number of people on board. V distance is how far offshore the vessel's operating, and so on. So then you take those variables, and here's the scripting. So you just create tables, and a table is an array. So you just run that scripting, and it creates me 5 tables just like this. So dock array is the documents, placards, and plans table. Bridge array is the bridge and navigation equipment table, and so on and so forth. So that's how it creates the tables. And so let's concentrate on one table, for example, the document, placards, and plans table. And so it's just scripting. It says if the doc, the variable document, is true, if they do have a document, if they said they had a document, then if it's true, then it just pushes the words right out to the table. So it just takes that language in quotes and moves it to the table, and then the table is presented to the user. If the answer to that question was false, then it would just go to the next item and say, well, then if the document is false, is the vessel less than 30 feet? And if it is, then this would print over there. And if it's greater than 30 or greater or equal to 30 feet, then it prints that into the table. And then once it's done there, then it goes to the next one and says, if the doc is true, then put this wording over in the table. So it's really that simple as to how the mechanics of the app work. And so you got some other questions?
Were you the scripter?
I was. If you want to learn how to do scripting, lynda.com is awesome. Not that I don't own stock in lynda.com, but that's where I kind of learned how to do all this stuff.
You guessed my question. Lisa is saying, thank you. Your presentation is especially great in giving very specific relationship and making it clear between the HPT model and your actions for this intervention. And I would agree with her. This is a really nice example of how performance improvement and what somebody does over the scope of a project feed together. Lisa is asking, how much of your individual time did this take?
I would say that it probably took me 6 months to develop, and that was not full time, but about 6 months. And I think that's a good question, and let me say something about that. So if you are a performance technologist in the real world, and you're trying to solve a performance gap that's been identified, and let's say, for example, it cost you $100,000 to hire yourself a web developer, and you do the rest of the work and feed them everything they need to develop your app, and you tell your company, I'll tell you what, I need $100,000 for this developer, and I'm going to save us $3 million. I think that's a good argument for getting money to get something to work. And I think that, again, if you use this case study, show them a real-life case that's actually online and being used to this day, I think that you could get somebody to cough up the money to develop a solution. I know you got to come up with the money to develop these things, and so I think this, as Gilbert would say, data in the environment is extremely cost-effective solution to a performance problem.
Lisa's asked another question. In the Coast Guard, how do you acquire the web development services you needed? And then how did you interact with them to scope and review during development and so on?
So the Coast Guard actually has the Performance Technology Center in Yorktown, Virginia. That's one of our main training centers. And we have a whole staff out there that are performance technologists that develop technology when it's appropriate. And so I could have handed this over to them. And in fact, a lot of the usability, for example, the pop-up menus and stuff, I went back to our Performance Technology Center in Yorktown for recommendations on how to get those pop-ups to work and stuff like that. So we actually have a section out there that works on that kind of stuff. I think that answers the question.
Oh, Dan, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us. Lisa says, thank you for a clearly understandable case study to prove the concept. Again, I agree with her. If people have additional questions, can they contact you at the email address you provided?
Yes, please. Yeah. One of the reasons I'm doing this is one of the reasons I submitted this for the Outstanding Performance Intervention Award was to push to everybody how strong this kind of a performance support solution is. And so I'd be glad to share with anybody more in-depth information. One of the links on the handout that's available to you all is actually all the scripting that makes this thing work. So that's available to you. Yeah, so please call me. Either get a hold of me at my email address or at the very beginning of the PowerPoint with my phone number. You're welcome to give me a call. If I don't answer the phone, just leave me a message. I'd be glad to give you a call back. But I'd like to help anybody I can to help them be successful at developing EPSSs when they're certainly the appropriate solution for the problem.
Thank you, Dan. Thank everyone who's still here. This concludes our webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today, Dan, and our participants.
Great, thank you.
Look forward to seeing all of you at future OPWL webinars. Goodbye.